we've got so much we have to do today. I want to make sure that we get started and especially honor everybody who got here on time. You deserve that we start on time. So I want to say thank you. Thank you to all. I first want to start by saying a sincere thank you to Leonardo. Leonardo, that's not Leonardo DiCaprio. This is Leonardo, the Italian aerospace company, which is also an American company now. And my very dear friend Bill Lynn is the president, and I'll turn it over to him very shortly. But you know, Bill and we've known each other for 40 years. He's held up a lot better than I have. Let's just say that. But it's his support that makes it possible for us to do this conference and every year, and I'm just very grateful to him. And I should also say Matt Green has also been a great partner, help us every step of the way in this. You know, the topic, you know, of this year, it's strength through the storm. I'm not sure it's a storm. It feels more like a hurricane. I mean, everything seems to be moving, and some significant uncertainty about where it lands. And I think we're kind of the eye of the storm here today. We're going to get some clarity about where things stand, where we're going. You know, if we're going to be, you know, waging tariff wars with allies, what does it say about defense and the coherence and the depth of our alliances? I mean, they're big questions that we have to think our way through. And I think we're lucky to have such a remarkable panel. This first one's going to be just terrific, and I look forward to that. So I want to say thank you to all of you for coming. We've got, you know, we're going to have a little bit of a variation early on because of all things, there are votes in the Senate this morning. We'd never used to do that, but everything is different right now. And so the first panel may be with us a little bit longer, and that's a good thing. And then we will, but we do anticipate still having the senators join us and also Chairman McConnell. So thank you all for being here. And let me turn to Bill Lynn and ask him to get us started for real. Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, John, and welcome to the 16th Annual Global Security Forum. This is the 16th year that Leonardo has sponsored this. It's been a terrific partnership with John and the folks here at CSIS. And we've always wanted to sponsor this because of the importance of this conference, and this year is no exception. This year we're focused on the intersection of industry, innovation, and American military power. It's a particularly uncertain time, as John indicated. The U.S. and its allies find themselves in unfamiliar territory. We're in the position where rival alliances seem to be growing closer. Our own alliances are becoming more uncertain. We're now, I think, more worried than we were about the reliability and the appropriateness of our industrial base. And our warfighting abilities are being challenged by the pace of technological change. And I think the panels you're going to hear over the course of the day are going to unpack those issues in very interesting and insightful ways. But before we get to that, I wanted to recognize John Hamre. He's as I think most of you know, is going to transition over the next year or so to a new role at CSIS. And it's I think the beginning of, I think, a long series of recognitions for his role. As I said, this is the 16th year of the Global Security Forum. It's the 25th year of John's leadership here at CSIS. And as John said, we've known each other 40 or so years, apparently since high school. And I've been with John at each of his stops. I knew him first at CBO, where we were on a study together. And then in his long tenure at the Armed Services Committee, where he was an institution. He worked for Senator Nunn. I worked for Senator Kennedy. We both then went into the Clinton administration in the department. He was first the comptroller, and then the deputy secretary. And I can still remember the day in the winter of 2000 when John announced he was going to leave the administration a little bit early to help a struggling think tank. Look at CSIS now, not struggling. Premier think tank in DC, inhabiting this beautiful building that John really was instrumental in bringing to CSIS and really established the identity of CSIS. It's really been a remarkable run, and it's a huge tribute to John's leadership. And I'd ask everybody to recognize John at this point. I'm going to turn now to Eric Chewning. The first panel is the evolution of Americans' defense industrial base, from Freedom Forge to the Last Supper to the first breakfast. I really want to hear each of those steps.
You must be very hungry.
Yeah. Eric has had a career both in government and industry. He started, I don't know where he started, but he was a long time at McKinsey. Then went into the first Trump administration running industrial affairs, and now he's leading strategy for one of the leading shipbuilders, Huntington Ingalls. Eric, let me turn it over to you.
Well, hey, good morning. I can't think of a better topic on a rainy Tuesday in Washington, D.C. than to discuss the evolution of the defense industrial base. I'm excited to kick off our panel this morning. Yeah, please, Arthur. And then I'm very excited to be joined on stage with former colleagues and friends. So to my left, Dr. Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow and Director of the Quantum Alliance Institute at the Quantum Alliance Initiative, the Hudson Institute. Dr. Seth Jones, President of Defense and Security Department here at CSIS. And then Jen Stewart, EVP for Strategy and Policy at NDIA and Senior Advisor at the Defense and Security Department here at CSIS. So a big round of applause for my panel. Wow. Before we jump in, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to do some quick items around housekeeping. First, you'll notice the QR codes. I have an iPad here where I will take your questions. So please, as we go through the day, shoot me questions, and I'll use that to help filter them into the panel. The second is, I wanted to start off with some framing around kind of where we are and to address kind of the industrial base evolution. So if you don't mind, please pop up my first slide. Perfect. So what you see here is a couple of things. The top row is the defense budget going back to the First World War in constant 2024 dollars. And what you see there over time is kind of the ebbs and flows based on various conflicts. The dark blue line is GDP, defense as a percent of GDP. Now, what you'll notice in the bottom row is effectively that evolution of the defense industrial base going back to the First World War. So through the First World War up until about 1940, our defense industrial base was predominantly populated by national arsenals, right? So government-owned facilities that made weapons. Then with the advent of World War II, as Arthur has written about with Freedom's Forge, as we drafted people into the military, we drafted American industry. And that industrial structure that came into place with World War II effectively was the industrial structure we had through the Cold War, where the defense industrial base was essentially populated by a broad set of diversified industrials, right? GM would make things for the consumers, would also make things for the military. Chrysler literally made cars, but also made tanks, right? And that's the industrial base we had up until the infamous Last Supper, right? Where the department said, we're going to have a peace dividend, we're going to cut defense spending, capacity needed to come out of the defense industrial base, and individual corporate actors made choices. Some decided to be consolidators, like a Lockheed Martin or a Northrop Grumman. Others decided they were going to exit the defense industrial base, and so they divested their defense businesses, right? So GM got rid of or Chrysler got rid of its tank plant, for example, right? And that industry structure we had effectively formed the industry structure we have today, where our defense industrial base is dominated by a handful of aerospace and defense specialists. Now, what's interesting about our moment in time is that we've got two sub-themes, and we'll explore these sub-themes here on the panel. The first was, within that A&D specialist industry structure, about the start of the global war on terror, there was a confluence of things that occurred. One was a shift towards government outsourcing. Two, there's a change in DoD policies around OCI. And the third was the need for the industrial base to expand rapidly to support operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. That led to the creation of a sub-ecosystem focused on government services. We're now in an interesting shift where we've had, and you really, I think, would credit SpaceX with this and the disruption it had in the launch market, where an advent of what I'll call national security tech players who are beginning to play a disruptive role in the sector. And most notably, as we see the confluence of events in Ukraine, as well as policy choices like DIU and the attempt to try and diversify the industrial base with these new national security technology players, are we entering into, as folks have said, sort of this first breakfast moment in time, where we'll see a shift in the defense industrial base with these new disruptive tech players? The second framing point I'd like to make is, if you go to the next slide, it's always important, in my opinion, when you discuss sort of defense industrial base issues, you do it on a comparative purposes. So what you see here is the top 5 revenues of the largest companies in China, the United States, and Europe that service the defense markets for their various countries. What you see with the Chinese industrial base, right, in aggregate, when you take those 5, it's larger than the top 5 US. It's also more diversified, right? So that light blue represents what those 5 companies get from defense revenues. What's white is effectively what they get from non-defense, right? So think of that industry structure more similar to what we had during the World War II and the Cold War, right? Where you've got very large industrial conglomerates that have portions of their industrial base focused on defense, but a lot of it outside of defense, right? Consistent with Chinese policies around civil-military fusion. The United States industry structure, as we talked about, right, still predominantly dominated by defense specialists. That non-defense portion is largely commercial aerospace, right? So largely A&D structure. And then in Europe, you get more of a 50-50 split. So this is where the ball sits today. Let's talk a bit about how the ball is going to advance going forward. You can go ahead and take the slides down and go QR code, please. And Arthur, I think it's probably the right time to pull you into the conversation. So when you look at industrial-based structures today, how do you think about our ability to scale in the event of mass conflict?
First of all, let me say, delighted to be here. Delighted to be here with this great audience, expert fellow panelists. Glad that we were able to put this together. When I look at where we are now in terms of defense industrial base, I see it really through 2 lenses. One is as an historian with the writing of Freedom's Forge and understanding it in World War II terms and how we were able to mobilize that defense industrial base. But I also see it from the work that I did for the last 2 years with the PPBE Reform Commission, the congressional commission that was put together to look at the Pentagon budget, to look at not the acquisition system, but the way in which the Pentagon paid for what it does buy and what it holds on to. They asked me to come on board to help them write their reports, and I was thrilled and delighted, learned a lot as a result of that. And one of the things that I learned was, number one, is that everybody is aware that we've got serious problems with this defense industrial base, especially with regard to scalability. Could we surge production? Are there ways in which we would, in the midst of let's say at the start of a conflict, a protracted conflict with an antagonist such as China, would we have the ability to be able to build the productive capacity and the innovation capacity in order to sustain a conflict like that? One of the lessons that came out of the war in Ukraine was we probably don't right now. And this has set off alarm bells all across industry, all across government, and around the world too, because so many allies also depend on us as being, in a sense, the workshop of defense industry and defense technology, because we have been all this time.
The arsenal of democracy.
The arsenal of democracy, that's it. And so what I begin to see here is that what I see is a change in the last 2 years. I would say my assessment 2 years ago would have been more pessimistic. There's a lot of work that has to be done, starting with the way in which the Pentagon spends its money and looks to bring in innovation. But at the same time, I'm also watching a change take place here of more and more companies and more discussion of people saying, we realize there's a problem. and that we need to, and we want to be part of the solution and how to deal with this and to rearm America and to do it safely but also efficiently. And here I'm going to quibble with you a little bit about your description about the World War II mobilization. It's true, we drafted young men into the service before war came in order, that was part of preparedness. But we didn't draft industry. Industry came to the government. It came to the government and said, what can we do to help? And it was really due to one man, the key figure in my book, Freedom's Forge, Bill Knudsen, the CEO of General Motors, that he was the one who went out to them and said, I need your help. I need your help as the most productive, the most innovative companies in America to help us ready for war. This is the summer of 1940, to ready for war in the hopes that it doesn't come, but in expectation that it might. And they answered his call. They answered the call that Knudsen went out and set for them as they figured out how they were able to meet what America's requirements would be. And it is, I think, this book has taken on a life of its own in so many ways, very different from what I had thought it would be when I wrote it 12 years ago. But the book is more than just about these amazing statistics and amazing changes that took place as a result of that mobilization in the 18 months before Pearl Harbor that Knudsen and his colleagues set in motion. It's also a book about leadership. It's also about how one or two executives, business leaders, government officials can lead and set in motion a transformation of America's industrial base, but also its ability to defend itself. And I think that's what I'm seeing now is a generation that's stepping up to deal with that kind of leadership.
It's interesting. There's a lot there we'll come back to. I think part of the moment in time we have now is you see industry stepping into the breach. You see private capital stepping into the breach. Will the department maintain their interest based on their ability to buy and provide a return, right? I think there's a narrative here with respect to that NatSec community where you got private capital into the space because Palantir was successful, because SpaceX was successful. If the next vintage of defense tech disruptors aren't successful, one nice thing about money is it's very fungible, right? And it'll go elsewhere where it needs a return. Both money and human capital will move where it gets its highest return. So Seth, you've written a book on this topic that'll be forthcoming. Spent a lot of time in China. How would you look at our position vis-a-vis the Chinese?
Well, I think it's interesting. You mentioned a little bit of this with one of the slides that you laid out. I think the reality where we sit today in 2025, first of all, before I get to the Chinese, is to touch on the Russians.
Yeah.
We have an ongoing war in Ukraine right now. The Russian industrial base, which has gotten assistance in its weapon systems, and the components for many of them from the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans. The Russian industrial base is clearly on a wartime footing. The country is at war. It has mobilized a range of its individuals into the Russian industrial base, and then a range of countries that have provided assistance. So we certainly have with the Russians, with all the challenges that they've had in the prosecution of the war, particularly the ground campaign, we have an industrial base that is on a wartime footing. I think as I look at the Chinese over the last couple of years, the way I would characterize China, with all its economic challenges, I think, which have received widespread coverage, is that their industrial base now, their defense industrial base, is on a wartime footing. What does a wartime footing mean? Wartime footing, at least as I would describe it, is they are building weapon systems across all the domains of warfare, air systems up into the 5th and 6th generation, maritime systems, large numbers of surface vessels, a lot of effort on subsurface, including unmanned or uncrewed systems, land systems, space, and cyber, as well as the network, the battle network, to try to knit those together. And the goal is, I think, to deter, and if deterrence fails, to fight and win a war, not just against anyone, but the United States. And that is when you start to look at the Chinese it's a difficult industrial base to look at because they're not transparent about a range of activities. But when you start looking at some of their factories that have increased the number of shifts on them or that have switched from commercial to industrial production, when you look at the activity and the consolidation of some of their state-owned enterprises, I would say pretty categorically they are on a wartime footing. Again, not that they are expecting that war will be inevitable. They will actually fight, but they are preparing to deter. And if deterrence fails, their industrial base is prepared. Just one or two other quick comments. And they have a lot of challenges that we can talk about. They've got weaknesses, they've got challenges, but they do have some advantages because the state can direct resources towards production. And this includes a range of emerging technology they're focusing on, including artificial intelligence and quantum. But they do have some advantages in how they're structured on mass and scale. Again, they've got a number of weaknesses that we can go through. But I would say the flip side of that is, as I look at the industrial base here in the U.S., probably would include the Europeans in this category, I would not make the same assessment. I would say the U.S. is not on a wartime footing right now. And ironic because its two major adversaries, particularly the Chinese, their industrial bases are in a very different position. They are thinking about them very differently. They're moving with a sense of urgency. The acquisitions timelines are starting to shrink in a range of areas. And that is very interesting to note. And it's something I think that what's missing is the urgency. There's a lot of talk, but how do we transition that into some of the changes we'll talk about on the panel?
Yeah, and just to pull on your point around the sense of urgency, I get asked this question occasionally because obviously shipbuilding is a sector right now where we all feel a sense of urgency to increase production. And so I was speaking to a mid-tier shipyard about outsourcing additional work because we'll outsource about 1 million hours worth of work out to the industrial base to help scale it. And for us to be able to give them the work, they needed to make improvements to a pier so that we could literally ship the things that they needed to sort of help make. And it was going to be a 2 to 3 year environmental review process before the pier reinforcement could begin to get started, right? And so in the back of my mind, I'll know we're at a wartime footing when it won't take a 2 or 3 year environmental remediation review for us to increase production in certain areas that we've prioritized from a defense industrial base issue. I'm sure there was a 2 or 3 year environmental review during Freedom's Forge.
No, there wasn't. 2 or 3. It was a 2 to 3 review between victory and defeat.
Yeah, and I say that to say not that say environmental permitting isn't important, but I think there's a balance here, right? There's a risk, right, and how we think about risk as we undertake these industrial activities. So Jen, the NDIA came out with a vital signs report. Gives us a bit of a snapshot about where we are from a defense industrial base perspective. Kind of what's your take on the position?
Thanks, Eric. And I just want to join my appreciation with Arthur's to Dr. Hamry and to Seth and Emily and Carrie for convening such a high impact agenda for today. I'm energized to hear from all the other panelists, and I appreciate the opportunity to represent industry on this panel. So thank you. The Vital Signs Project, Eric, started from a couple data points. First, the association has over 1,700 members. We represent every sector of the defense industrial base, so the traditional defense contractors, the non-traditional defense contractors, small, medium, large companies, individual small businesses. We have labs, the FFRDCs. So we really have a wonderful opportunity to hear all the different angles and where the challenge points are. We had looked at reestablishing the annual report right around the time that the Ukraine crisis had hit the point where there was an understanding in the national security community that if the defense industrial base was not postured to give national policymakers the response options they needed, that we were going to constrain the ability of the U.S. to lead in areas we wanted them to. So when I think about where we are right now, I tend to break it into what's positive, what's just deep fight neutral work, and where are the watch items. So what's positive right now? One, when you were in the building as a senior leader, or Ellen Lord, who was here last night, the leadership and the cultural expectation was Ellen's got this or Eric's got this. One of the things that I think is a positive contribution to what needs to shift from a leadership and culture perspective is you see more of the senior civilian and military leaders taking ownership over their own literacy about industrial base issues, and I think that's incredibly positive. The second thing is all the conversations are about, we have such innovative talent out in industry, both in, to your point, with the aerospace and defense, and then from the high-tech industry. The conversation is about we have to find innovation and we have to find talent. It is there. And the third piece that I would say is there is a very encouraging political moment where the factors are coming together, where people want to shake up a system that they think is no longer working. Yeah. And so capitalizing on that political moment with the right information and the right policy solutions, I see as incredibly positive. Shifting to areas that I think are just deep fight, our culture is a immediate convenience, immediate gratification culture. And I think we need to take a step back and really internalize the fact that it took 30 years to posture the defense industrial base where it is. And we can't act as if 1 or 2 years of we're gonna put a lot of time and attention on this, that it'll be fixed. And so making sure that we don't get into a fatigue of why haven't we solved the problem by now is gonna be incredibly important. We also need to get better at literacy around 2 areas that I think we talk a lot about, but don't necessarily have the fingertip feel of how they behave, both how they're incentivized and disincentivized. We're getting better at understanding how publicly traded companies, how their investors look at opportunities and what drives investment decisions. But I do think while we talk about it, we need to get better at understanding how private capital works. And we tend to say private capital. So understanding how private equity looks at opportunities and makes evaluations, venture capital, and then the new space that's opening up, family offices and patient capital. And the other area that just is going to take good governance oversight is we need to pay attention to the human capital. Eric and Arthur, you both mentioned it, and we talk about that in the industrial context. We need to be paying attention to what's happening in the government context right now, particularly the acquisition workforce and the contracting officers. Not just who is available, but have we trained them in the right skill sets, particularly as we talk about moving to more commercial products and services. Have they gotten that training that they need to be able to move at the speed of relevance that we all ask them to? And then watch items, it's important to always start, and my eyes even glaze over because we've been talking about it for 16 years, but the lack of budget stability is really harming the nation. We need to talk, and Arthur mentioned it as well, about what do we actually need to do to stop talking about and remove the barriers to scaling production in a meaningful way. We need to have conversations about if we want to move to more commercial determinations. The US government is actually not comfortable with a lot of commercial best practices in that area. One immediate example would be intellectual property. And finally, I would say we need to be paying attention to what I call, in my head, the public trust bucket. And I break that down into 2 pieces, Eric. One, a lot of what we'd consider the accumulation of regulation was based on perceived or real feeling that companies were not good stewards of taxpayer dollars. And as we reduce regulation across the board, making sure we understand what that's going to look like from a public trust perspective is going to be important. And the other areas around testing and evaluation. This isn't a commercial market where if you get it wrong, you just put out the next iteration of the product and the consequences are basically market capture. We're talking about the men and women who are raising their hands to go serve in places that we are not serving. And so the consequences of getting it wrong are high. And so making sure on that balance beam between moving quickly and reducing risk, that we really have settled out in a way that we're all willing to support where that fulcrum point needs to be.
Yeah, that's great, Jen. And Arthur and Seth, thank you. There's a lot to work with here. And I appreciate the questions we've got rolling in from everybody in the audience, so thank you. So let me put a quick frame on kind of our discussion here, and then I'll start pulling in questions from the audience. So at the end of the day, right, competition's about winning. So what is the industrial base we need to either deter and or defeat our peer competitors?
That's it. I'll tell you what, to answer that question, I'm going to give you two statistics from the World War II era. The first one is when Bill Knudsen, the protagonist of my book, went to a subcontractor for General Motors called Saginaw Steering Gear. And they made, well, you can guess what they made for various automobile companies. And he asked them if they thought they could produce machine guns, 30 caliber machine guns based on the Browning 30 caliber design. And the engineers, this is in October of 1940, right? Just as things are getting rolling.
Yep.
So he asked them, and they sort of said, well, actually, we've never actually seen a machine gun, a 30 caliber machine. Could you show us a couple of examples? And so he did, and they looked at it and said, yeah, I think we can make some of those. So they signed a contract, October 1940, to deliver 260 30 caliber machine guns by March of 1942. And they did. They delivered in March of 1942. They delivered not 260 30 caliber machine guns, but 28,000. That's the power of mass production. That's what Knudsen was tapping into, even though that company had never done anything like this. And there are many examples I summarize in the Freedom's Forge of this. Even though they had never made something like that, they understood how to mobilize what they did best, productivity, and to make changes in the design, which they did. That innovation, we always talk a lot about innovation, but innovation in many ways flows from productivity. That the most productive are often the ones who are always thinking about, I can do this better, I can figure out a way to make it faster, make it cheaper, and so on. That's what Bill Knudsen realized could be mobilized on a voluntary basis by tapping into industry. The other statistic, this one is not in the book. That summer, the Army decided they need a new general purpose vehicle, light utility vehicle. A general purpose comes to be called the GP, the Jeep. And they put together a list of specifications for it. You know, that had to be all-wheel drive, had to be all-terrain capable, and it had to be light enough that 6 guys could pick it up and turn it 180 degrees in case it got stuck somewhere, right? It's a rugged vehicle they're looking for. So the Army put together a list of specifications. They I still can't believe this happened. They sent out 286 RFPs, companies across America. Exactly 2 companies answered. None of the major automobile companies wanted anything to do with the federal government, let alone the Army. They knew it would be expensive. They'd have to make their own prototypes. They would never get a contract. The 2 companies that did, one was Bantam Equipment. They made farm machinery. They were about to go bankrupt. And this was the last roll of the dice. They figured, you know what, might as well, we've got nothing else. We're our backs to the wall. It's this or Chapter 11. So they sent in a proposal. The other one was Willis Overland, which was run by an automobile designer of genius by the name of Barney Roos, who had worked in Europe, had worked in Italy, as a matter of fact, with companies like Fiat. And he always figured that that there was a market in America for small cars, not these big chrome-plated, Chrysler, Buick, Cadillac things, but small cars that people could get around from place to place. So he was not at all interested in doing something for the Army. This was a stepping stone for him for creating a consumer market via a government contract. Well, I think most of you know the rest of that story of how Willis won the final contract and then created a design that not only was ubiquitous, 500,000 of these vehicles in the course of World War II for U.S. and its allies, and a design one that lasts until today, right? That's still here today. And so I think what we see is 2 snapshots, right? One is the second story, what it was like, what people were thinking about in 1940, what it meant to work with the government. Don't. Big mistake, right? Sound familiar in some regards for a lot of our companies today? The other one was if you could get those companies to do their work, to step in, to get those government contracts, the results could be amazing. And from my perspective right now, in terms of addressing all of the issues that we're talking about, that you've summarized so beautifully here, that one of the tasks, I think, for leadership is to widen the circle of companies that we think about as defense industry firms and of defense and defense-related technology firms, to widen that circle so that it embraces the most productive, so it brings in all of the innovation and productivity that exists in other areas, and that they feel that they're part of this great mission as well.
Eric, what if I could jump into one aspect of this, because I want to build on the Knudsen point, and then highlight a couple of examples of it and get to the concept of offset. Because one of the things I think, as I also look at the Knudsen story, and that as you talk about in Freedom's Forge too, is it also took a phone call from the President of the United States to bring Bill Knudsen to Washington. So there was also a decision at the White House that this was an important issue. This was well before Pearl Harbor, and that it was important to make progress in this area. And so there was, at that point, FDR, and I think what's important as you look at several periods of time after World War II, where the U.S. has made some progress even in very specific situations on its industrial base, it's worth highlighting also the role of senior government officials in identifying the importance of this. So I want to give a couple of quick examples and then sort of pull it to today, because I think this also, I think, helps us realize this is not just about companies per se and technology per se, but where I think it's part of an effort to offset a major competitor. So there's a concept of operations that becomes important in this discussion. So if we go to the mid to late 1950s, Eisenhower does not want to deploy large numbers of American forces to Europe. He's concerned about how much that would cost, but he recognizes that the Soviet conventional advantages have to be offset. So if you're not going to do it by building, by sending a number of American forces to Europe, then his decision as part of New Look was to make those investments in nuclear weapons and into bombers that can carry them. So what we have during that offset period is you're offsetting a major competitor, and the decision by the president was Titan, Polaris, and a whole range of weapon systems to prevent, actually to deter. This is important also because I think we realize in some of these cases that the U.S. is able to make some decisions without actually going to war. I mean, one of the great things about the Freedom Forge example is how much was done before the U.S. was ever directly involved. Eisenhower offsets Soviet advantages. The U.S. is never at war there, but it is in a major competition, and those offset decisions deter war. That's right. If you fast forward to the 1970s, there's a great memo that I came across by Harold Brown, the Secretary of Defense under Jimmy Carter, and Bill Perry is working with him at this point. And what they've done is Perry and Brown are becoming increasingly concerned about the U.S. Losing deterrence in Europe, in particular with the Soviets. The Soviets have not only continued to have advantages in conventional military might in Europe, they still have those advantages, but they also now have nuclear parity. So the red flags are all over the place that the U.S. is in serious danger of losing deterrence. At that point, if you go back, there are all these debates in the U.S. about 3-to-1 advantage, or do they have more of an advantage? And I think what's interesting, at the end of Carter, and then during Reagan, is there's, again, no war here, but a very deep-seated concern by the intelligence community the U.S. was losing deterrence. And that war was possible, maybe even likely, if the U.S. didn't act with a sense of urgency. So at that point, you get this decision by Carter, but then by Reagan, again, so so FDR and a range of people, Eisenhower, Carter and then Reagan, to focus on stealth. So this is what comes out of Lockheed Skunk Works. Kelly Johnson had moved on. This was Ben Rich then. This was folks at Texas Instruments that were building Paveway 1, 2, and 3. This was the laser-guided bombs. and all the stuff that went into the sort of concepts of a salt breaker, that you had the U.S. think through how do we use technology under a range of concepts that can deter the Soviets from pushing through in the Fulda Gap. And I think the question for us now is not just what kinds of technology do we build, how do we reignite the industry, but how do we do that also under a broader framework that we can offset some of the advantages we see the Chinese industrial base producing at mass and scale. And so one last comment along these lines is, some of the war games we've done here and have done elsewhere, Mark Hansian and some folks from MIT and the Naval War College and Ben Jensen, we've done a couple of different types of games, blockade, PLA, amphibious invasion of Taiwan and others. There are a range of things that really you start to focus on. And it's a combination of both, small attritable systems, but also some pretty big, serious platforms. Yeah. And this debate we're having right now about, we need small attritable systems. Drones. When you play in these war games, like drones or UUVs, which end up being, you also see that actually you need submarines. Yeah. And because the PLA can't find them, their anti-submarine warfare is not very good. You need bombers, and you need to be able to shoot long-range anti-ship missiles at invading forces. So what's the concept of operations that we're thinking through to offset some of the Chinese advantages in mass and scale? I think that's where that part of this discussion, I think, has been missing.
That's right. Yeah. I think the other thing, too, I think Seth's touched on it beautifully. The offset paradigm is a way in which you can mobilize and scale your defense industrial base without depending on a war coming at the last resort. These examples, that's why I always say I think Freedom's Forge was the first offset, because Bill Knudsen saw that the key advantage we could leverage versus the Axis powers was our industrial base, our mass production, and our capacity to make anything in large numbers, even tanks and even aircraft carriers. And if you're going to do an offset, you're right. Presidential leadership is crucial. And that call that Roosevelt made to Knudsen, that was not a popular decision in his circles. They were horrified. They said, Knudsen, they said, the guy is a Republican. He's a flaming capitalist. Why are you bringing him in to make these crucial decisions here? Eleanor, particularly, was scandalized about it. But Roosevelt realized that if it was just a top-down decision made by his usual New Deal circle of experts, that nothing significant was going to happen. He was going to have to mobilize industry, and he had to go to someone, interestingly, not in the armaments industry, but outside, from a company, from the manufacturing side, to come and to figure out a way in which we could mobilize that enormous industrial base and all of the potential that it had to prepare us for war.
So I've often thought offsets and defense modernization, 4 things have to be present, right? We need a concept, we need a technology, I need an acquisition approach that'll go and find the technology in the time of relevance, and then
the cluster
technologies, right? And then I need funding, and I need stable funding so there's a demand signal to industry so they can scale, right? Yeah. And the problem is if one of those 4 things isn't present, you don't get it. Jen, acquisition reform and that middle piece about how do we actually reform ourselves to go and marry up the technologies in an environment where I have funding with the concept at the rate of relevance continues to be an issue.
Yes.
And I think to your earlier point, increasingly, Arthur, this gets to what you said about how we widen the circle. I'm not just widening the circles to more industrial actors, I'm actually widening the circles to more types of capital. And those different capitals will operate under different discount rates, and they're all looking for different things and different incentives in which the department has tried to standardize in such a way where you may not get a return consistent with what all those different types of capital providers are trying to get at. From a policy perspective, an acquisition reform perspective, how do you begin to square that circle?
So I want to take a step back and pull forward some of the comments both Seth and Arthur made for the current context, which is, again, for many that you've convened in the room today who've served at the highest levels of government, they know this, but just a baseline for everyone. Fundamentally, what we're looking for is to maximize two things right now: credible national deterrence and credible response options for the National Command Authority. So we need to start with, and this is the piece of the debate in the current context that I think can get shunted to the side a little bit. When we think about strategic stability, and when we think about, and I always cite, because I know I won't get into trouble, the congressional posture statements from the European Combatant Commander and the Indo-Pacific Combatant Commander. When you look at what's not being consumed in the Russian arsenal in the Ukraine context, and if you look at what the consistency across at least the last 4 Indo-Pacific Combatant Commanders are saying, we have work we need to do on some of our strategic assets that are going to be part of this conversation. And these strategic assets are the ones where we're already behind from a schedule perspective. They were sacrificed in deferred budget decisions during the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And those are areas where if you're not on the timeline, no amount of yelling at anybody is going to change that timeline. So I think we need to pay attention to that, and I'm really worried that we're shunting those kind of conversations to the side. The second thing that we need to really focus on is we are doing a really good job of giving people early seed investment funding. But when I talk to companies in the space, a big problem that they're hearing is, one, they'll be told, we have a requirement. Okay, well, where's the money? There is no money. Or we have a requirement and you get to the PEO and they say, well, we know this is a requirement, but here are the other 4 things we've been told to prioritize before you. So I think the number one, and again, this is just, basic blocking and tackling of the conversation, is in an era where we're having a conversation about the first time in its history, the Department of Defense is under a full year CR. There is a plausible path forward in September. I'm not advocating for it, and I'm hoping my comments don't interject bad karma into the process. But there's certainly a plausible path forward that come the end of the fiscal year, we could be looking at another phase of a CR. Yeah. So from a funding perspective, are we actually putting the right investment into every angle of the problem set that we need to make sure that the Joint Force has the full suite of capabilities they will need to deal with, and this is a strategic theme that Seth's been trying to push in this conference, the plausible situation of simultaneity. Yeah. And it won't be from one vector, and it won't be from one sector. And so we tend to start talking about, well, we need to look at cost differentials of what mass attritable against high exquisite capabilities in certain contexts mean for us as a nation, and those are responsible conversations. But it can't be just about that piece. It has to be about what peer-on-peer conflict is going to look like.
One of the areas we haven't talked about yet is allies and partners. So how do we think about the role of an allied industrial base, right? Clearly, we've got AUKUS, right, around the sort of marquee US, UK, Australia effort. 2 pillars there, right? Pillar 1 around the transfer of nuclear-powered submarines to Australia, and then the second, Pillar 2, range of technologies around our collaboration. How do you all factor in the allied industrial base into those considerations?
I think it's going to be crucial in many regards. And this is why I think having this discussion here and in the context of the work that this institution has been doing in helping to bring companies like Leonardo into the discussion and to think about and participate in thinking strategically about how U.S. and its allies can work together on industrial-based issues will be important. That's why I have been, over the last couple of years, promoting this idea of the arsenal of democracies, right, in which U.S. and allies bring together their most innovative and most productive companies and technologies and work together to address key strategic issues, from hypersonics and unmanned systems all the way to space, and the kinds of the range of technologies which can be deployed there, will have to be deployed there in order to deter China as we go forward. The arsenal of democracy's idea, I think, and I've written a joint article with Chairman McCall about how important AUKUS is as an agreement and as a paradigm for this kind of cooperation, not just in terms of building submarines, which is important, but also in terms of promoting cooperation on other advanced technologies, from AI and quantum to automated systems. That at the same time, I think we also have to look beyond I won't say the usual, look beyond MOUs and government-to-government agreements, but to really encourage company-to-company collaboration and linkages, and to let companies say, you know what, the Defense Department is looking for this, and you guys in Germany, you guys in Italy, you guys in Japan or South Korea, the two of us could really do something amazing and maybe make a lot of money by answering the call and by developing a system that addresses those kinds of requirements, that steps into that area. I think that taps into a reservoir of innovation and productivity that international collaboration between the U.S. and its allies is just beginning to realize its power.
So if I could build off of what Arthur just said, I think the reality, the landscape today is one where, and Jen just mentioned this, is that you've got, and we've seen this particularly since the full-scale Russian invasion in February of 2022, we've got more cooperation between the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Iranians than we've probably ever seen.
Yeah.
And it's in multiple different areas. Now,
they've done an amazing job, haven't they? I mean, you got to give them credit.
Now, there are fissures. I'm not saying there's sort of a clear multilateral alliance per se, but there are a strengthening of relations. We've seen the Xi Jinping and Putin meet over 50 times. What's been also interesting is how much industrial-based cooperation they've been doing.
Tremendous.
It's not just that the Iranians are selling Shaheeds to the Russians, but they're building them in Russia now.
Yep.
So we've seen that. We've seen cooperation in most of the domains, space, for example. We've seen as part of the North Korean deployment of soldiers, the Russians helping them in a couple of different industrial areas. So what I think it also says, it's going to be really hard to predict. One is if conflict arises, where it occurs. So you're going to have to deter in multiple theaters. Second, if conflict does break out, I think it's going to be hard to contain it into a specific region. Again, we've already seen a fair amount of assistance from a number of countries to the Russians in the European theater. How would that look in a Taiwan contingency, or between the Japanese and the Chinese in the East China Sea, or between the Philippines and the Chinese, or even an expansion in the Iranian context, where we've now had the Russians and the Chinese providing aid to the Iranians and the Houthis as part of those actions against the U.S. Navy and the Israelis. So I think what that, we're seeing collaboration on the other side. I think if you look at trade, even in the defense industry, and just broadening it to the industry itself, they're just comparative advantages across companies in different countries. Which means, and a lot of interest in co-production, co-development, co-sustainment, and that brings us to this broader issue on the acquisition and contracting side. Are we well suited to a wartime environment? And by wartime, I don't mean that we want to go to war. You want to deter, but you got to have that mentality that if deterrence fails, you're going to fight. And a strong deterrent means the other side knows that you are willing to do it if the Soviets understood that if they pushed through the Fulda Gap, we were going to fight. So I think the question is for ITAR, for foreign military sales, how quickly are we able to get material to the countries? How how much are we able to share technology? I realize there are some areas where it's particularly sensitive in some of the nuclear space, but in general, are we operating in a wartime environment where we need to move with urgency? And I think the answer there is still no.
Yeah.
And that's a problem with allies and partners. You know, it is difficult to sit with senior Taiwanese leaders and hear the list of items that even in that environment that are backlogged. I mean, how is that not a priority right now? So, I mean, for me, it's the urgency sometimes is there in how we speak about it, but it is not materialized in all cases in how we're able to operate with allies and partners.
Eric, let me jump in on this. I'll start with AUKUS, and as a point of personal privilege, I'm actually where I am because of AUKUS. You know, most of my career was spent in the government, and when I came out and AUKUS was announced, I was one of the cheerleaders. I thought it was brilliant strategy, and to protect the innocent, I won't name them, but I had a couple admirals put me in a headlock and say, Jen, you've been looking at the submarine construction schedules for 15 years. You're not making any connection between this announcement and the industrial realities. So I'm like, all right, time to go get educated, right? So when you look at AUKUS as a pathfinder for what 3 extraordinarily sophisticated allies can do together, it has been remarkable what the governments have achieved, but it has also exposed there's still opportunities. And Seth, I would argue we are acting as if we're in a peacetime environment. So I will answer your question and say we're not meeting the moment. But we are learning a lot right now. We are learning about the limits of cooperation in a peacetime environment when it comes to how different countries look at control of technology, to your point, re-export, sovereign data enclaves, classification and information sharing. There's a lot of opportunities to really work through hard, complicated issues now while there's still time, and then apply those lessons forward. I do think for Pillar 2, we're still in a little discovery learning. There's 3 different visions of what Pillar 2 can look like. So that needs more work. But the other 2 areas I would mention that I think are relevant is, one, there's really important, thoughtful work going on right now in the department, working with allies and partners along the lines that Arthur and Seth have mentioned about policy optimization. How do we rationalize export policies such as ITAR, workforce availability, supply chains? And Arthur, this gets to your point of what they're trying to do is, can the government facilitate a peacetime regional economic framework where commercial to commercial without government involvement can find each other and start finding those synergies? And that work is in the process of getting set up, but the fact that it is happening is incredibly important. And the last thing I would mention is the Ukraine context exposed a lot that it won't be a US only solution. It will be working with our allies and partners of, on the modern battlefield, we are going to have companies that are going to be perceived as players on the battle. And what does that mean from an authorities perspective? What does that mean from an insurance perspective? The space industry is very focused on this right now in the Ukraine context. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done there, but I think the fact that people are leaning into identifying it and trying to get organized is important.
I'll take there was a shipbuilding question from the audience as it relates to allies and partners. I'm happy to field that one, and it relates to AUKUS, right? So personal experience, we have a joint venture in Australia with the UK firm Babcock International, right? So it's an Australian company with a US and UK parent. I think of that as like the manifestation of AUKUS. But to your point, it's a new beast. And so getting that work through from a policy perspective and how does that actually operate is a challenge. There's a lot of interest in US, Korean, Japanese collaborations on shipbuilding. We have an MOU with Hyundai Heavy Industries to begin to explore how that could work. So I think this idea that you've got industry to industry interaction to try and build some connective tissue is certainly underway. The question is just, our government policies and funding, will it continue to sort of feed, right, those interactions? Because at the end of the day, that's the signaling effect I think industry needs from government. One of the questions here And Jen, this one was directed towards you. You noted the impacts of budget instability. What's your sense for the sense that members of Congress understand the granular detail of the impacts of the CRs? I think everyone understands at a high level, CR bad, but to what extent do folks really understand the disruptive impact it has on the department?
It's a very fair question, and I would put myself first in line of when you look at things from one angle of a problem set, sometimes even if you think you understand the other angles, you may not fully understand them. I would say for members of Congress, one of the things I think is missing sometimes is when they are feeling good about the fact that there is a CR, they're looking at what the alternative could have been, in which case a lapse of appropriations or a government shutdown. And when you look at the current environment, it's very easy to trip into a government shutdown. It is very hard to dig out of one. And so the psychology around what was avoided, I think, matters for that conversation. I do think that there's more work that needs to be done to help connect in the immediate what the impact of businesses are. A lot of small companies can't cash flow through the length of a CR while they're waiting, and so they end up letting employees go. And most of the deadlines for funding tend to happen around the holidays, so that's not good. And that leads to your point about capital, human capital flight. And then the deeper fight that it's still hard to always see it in the moment. You usually can see it in the rearview mirror, is deferred decisions, like Gimler's, for example. Is one that constantly comes up, which is, 2015, 2016, 2017, in that time frame, there was an opportunity to ramp up production. We were operating under CRs, so we didn't. Ukraine happens, and then everyone's like, where are the Gimlers? So there is more work to be done, but I think it's important to, and I bring my former congressional hat to the conversation, it's important to work with the members to help them see the holistic impact, but also appreciate where they're coming from.
Arthur, you and I have talked about this, the role of workforce. And I think one of the maybe examples from Freedom Forge was you had 50% of the population that you could immediately bring into the workforce. That's not the case now. So as you think about workforce being one of the longest lead items, what policies do we need to have in place so we can sort of get a Freedom Forge-like effect with the current workforce dynamics in the U.S. economy?
Yeah, it's the worry, everybody. And it usually tends to be number 4 of 5 priorities. That's usually where it winds up. Everyone realizes we've got workforce issues we have to address. But the amount of attention and the amount of real sort of planning that goes into that and implementation tends to get lost in the other priorities. Particularly in Congress and particularly in government, that's the case. There's a number of reasons for that I'm not going to go into. But at the same time, when I look at the World War II example, for example, which you realize again is that the mobilization was entirely voluntary. Nobody told workers where to go. We didn't have a wartime economy in the way in which our allies did, for example, in which they were telling people we need workers here and then move people over there. People went where the wages were. And those companies, like Henry Kaiser's shipyards, that paid the highest wages and threw in benefits like health care, tended to draw people. And they would quit their factories working in Detroit and take the train out to Richmond, California, or out to Portland, Oregon. And, the floor managers were furious, the foremen were furious, but there was nothing they could do. It was an entirely... the demographic shifts, which were tremendous, the biggest demographic shifts in American history took place during World War II as that workforce spread out across the country. All of it was unplanned. All of it was brought by companies saying, if you come in the door, we'll train you to do the job you need to do. And it was interesting that throughout that whole experience, in terms of bringing people into the workforce who had never done industrial work in their lives, including women, including minorities. It was very, very hard to maintain the rules for Jim Crow, for example, when you needed workers of whatever color or whatever sex in order to get your work done on these ships or on these tanks or on this equipment here. And so I think what we have today is the advantages they never had.
Yeah.
The advantages, for example, of AI as not just as a way to replace workers with automation, but as a way to train workers, as a way to get young people to understand what the tasks are that are involved, which are not that complicated in working in a factory or in a facility in many ways. That there's an AI in terms of security and industrial security issues, so that you can have some degree of security and trust that the people you bring online to work on sensitive topics aren't going to leak that out or put their flash disk inside the computer in order to take it home to work and other things. Industrial security is something we didn't have to worry about in World War II with very small incidents. Today, of course, it's a major, major concern. And it should be a concern with regard to workforce as well. But there are technologies that we have, there are ways in which we can mobilize those technologies to overcome and to be force multipliers in dealing with workforce. My own suggestion is that we tend to think about workforce issues as an obstacle, as a problem to be solved. What if we thought about it as an opportunity? As an opportunity to grow out our workforce, to get our young men and young women involved in industrial jobs and in supporting the work that we do there, and as an opportunity to see what all these amazing new technologies can do to make factories, facilities, shipyards hum again.
Yeah. Seth?
Yeah, so a few things on this, and it's interesting, over the last 2 or 3 years, I've had the opportunity to visit a number of, whether it's air, maritime, land-based production facilities, and workforce obviously is a dominant subject. So a few things just, based on those visits and discussions. One of them, and this partially gets to one of the things Arthur just mentioned, is, with the sense of urgency and a national priority, how much do workers feel for them to enter the sector that they're part of something bigger? Yeah. And so, that's where the urgency and the national priority, it's in part why people work for the federal or the state government. They're part of a broader effort. There's a patriotic effort to what they're doing. And as part of that, there have been some interesting efforts in various locations of how combinations of industry, state, local government, and sometimes federal government have provided incentives and programs to bring in individuals from vocational schools, at trade schools more broadly, in areas where there may not be a lot of employment opportunities, or that they're willing to build skill sets for jobs that they can have for a long period of time. So there's that, how do you message that this is part of a national priority? How do you find ways to bring in individuals at the high school or even lower level and provide STEM training for the industrial sector? Because these are electricians, pipe fitters. I mean, there are a whole range of professions along these lines. There's also this element, I think. How do you give industry confidence that the government is going to make this a priority for some period of time, the foreseeable future? Because this is where, from a workforce perspective, it gets hard. Is when you think of wages or other workforce-related issues, it costs money. And if you're not sure, because of the CR, because our defense budget as a percentage of GDP is lower than it at any point during the Cold War. And I'm not really talking about the sort of 46, 47 period where it dipped after the end of World War II. Even the Carter years, we're well below that period. So we're not spending a lot as a percentage of GDP, regardless of how there's sticker shock discussion of the defense budget. But as you look at it as a percentage of our GDP, it's actually relatively small. But what is the indication? What are the confidence levels we're giving industry that we're serious about this so they can build the capital, expand the production facilities along these lines? Because these are high-risk efforts for companies. And for me, like the workforce, if you're going to build a workforce, you have to give not just signal, but money, build money into contracts for companies that they can take these efforts, which are going to be risky. If next year there's peace in Ukraine and a relatively low defense budget, and we go back to where we were in 2021 or 2020, and then companies will have invested and they'll be on the hook now. So I mean that's you have to, when you owe your shareholders every year the responsibility that your company is fiscally productive, that's part of this environment. And I think as we've talked about various places in U.S. history where we've operated with a sense of urgency, but also brought them money, I think this is kind of the place we have to get to.
So obviously we're the largest employer in a couple states and manage a fairly large workforce of trade skills. And I think for us, the challenge just comes down to this idea that says how do you maintain and attract that talent, given that we've had an industrial policy in this country in place that subsidized people going to college, and we haven't glorified trades, right? We haven't subsidized the ability for folks to go out and get trade skills. We maintain our own apprentice skill programs, but it is largely a state and local effort. And, it is time to rethink things like Pell Grants, right? Why not be able to use a Pell Grant to go get certified to be a welder or pipe fitter or something?
Or Eric, in an area where there's shipbuilding, take any state, and housing is expensive.
Yeah.
How do you deal with a housing problem for workers at shipyards or other facilities? Are you going to build low-cost housing and help them out? Are you going to increase wages? I mean, those are serious front and center issues for people that want to work at that location, and it's too expensive to live there.
And this won't just be an issue for defense-related topics. It'll be a broader issue for any reindustrialization activity in the United States.
And here I'm going to say what I wasn't going to say. And that is,
well, say it.
And that is regard to workforce. And that is that when you have government officials, and I'll even say congressional staff who went to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Cornell, Stanford, it's hard for them to put themselves in the position of people with high school equivalency degrees who come from families and towns in which that blue collar is the world they know. It's hard for them to understand how you incentivize people with whom you share. You have no common experience in that direction here. And I think one of the issues that we are going to have to address in terms of addressing workforce is really understanding who it is you're going to want to bring on board. What do they want that's going to bring them in to take these kinds of jobs and to become part of this? And Seth, I think, put it very nicely, to be part of something bigger. Mm-hmm. Now, I see this with workforce and space industry. The workforce and space industry often have that sense that they're doing something that's really cool, but it's also important for the country as well, particularly if they're working on defense-related topics and discussions. But if you can get that sense that what you're doing is part of your patriotic duty, but also something that'll give you a really good living and set you up for life at the same time, then I think you're going to begin to see packages, incentive packages that'll come together that'll really draw and attract the talent you're going to be looking for.
Eric, if I can just briefly, I'd like to associate myself with everything that's been said. And I think to your point about the dignity and respect piece, Seth, when you look at what the Navy's been doing with local state governments, but even the senators who are showing up to the ceremonies when they get their certificates and saying, what you're doing, you're artisans, you're doing something that the rest of us can't do, and we need to respect and honor it. And by the way, this is going to provide you and your family with an excellent career path. Those are important. We've been encouraging through our annual report for the other services to look at whether they're appropriately calibrated, and encouraging some of their departing service members to also pursue the trade school path and the skilled workforce path as a very honorable profession that will make an excellent livelihood. The other piece of the conversation that still needs work and can be a bit uncomfortable to talk about is when we look at the areas of, I don't want to say emerging technologies, but evolving technologies. For the defense sector in particular, or companies that are looking at dual use, we still are struggling on recruiting and retaining a workforce that can meet security requirements.
Yeah.
You know, one example would be the disconnect between federal and state laws around recreational drug use, for example. So I think that there's going to be more work that needs to be done there, and we also need to acknowledge that current regulations mean that the not just salary, but the fringe benefit packages aren't competitive with the purely commercial sector, and that matters based on the surveys that the largest company HR officers have been putting out globally. That's consistent feedback they're getting on their recruiting and retention problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just on this issue, workforce, none of what we've talked about will happen unless we don't get the manufacturing workforce we need. It also is a heavy dose of what new Industry 4.0 technologies are we injecting into how we make things, right? Mm-hmm. So additive, digital design tools, all those things to help accelerate. And I think this is an area where the defense tech disruptors we've talked about are a good example, right, of what's possible, and then how legacy defense industry can take those lessons learned and apply them to our manufacturing processes, but then also, how the acquisition regulation environment needs to accept that and needs to encourage that type of technology adoption. Another question, Arthur, just around the limits of the World War II analogy.
Yeah.
So, we think about the environment today where the large U.S. industrials are multinational, right? How do you think about the limits to which you would see that level of industrial response given sort of a broader stakeholder analysis that may occur in some boardrooms?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, and I'm delighted that people find so much inspiration from Freedom's Forge and say, there's so many great answers to the problems we face today in that book. I encourage that outlook and that approach. But I think as Eric just pointed out, we also have to think about what's different from that environment, what made that mobilization possible, which is not the case today in the same conditions. Number one is in 1940, we were the industrial colossus of the world. We had a manufacturing industrial base second to none that once it put its shoulder to the wheel of rearming America was able to bring about miracles of production. We had the supply chains that were basically everything we needed, everything our factories needed was here in the 48 states. Some rare earths, some strategic materials from Latin America, but basically the supply chain was right here in the US. That's not the case anymore. We have global supply chains now. Adds an extra level both of logistical complication for mobilizing industrial base, but also strategic vulnerabilities, as we know, in the case we get involved in a conflict with China, for example. Number three, the industrial security issue that I touched on. This was a very minor concern during World War II. Now in the age of cyber, it should be a major concern in terms of protecting the way in which sensitive technologies and sensitive data is passed within a defense industrial base, the vulnerabilities we face and have to address, including vulnerabilities of allies. I worked for a long time with regard to defense industrial base security issues with Japan and thinking about how to gear up and the level of equivalence with regard to defense industrial security. Not a problem in World War II, big problem today. But I would also say there's one advantage with all those limitations that we face today that we didn't face. There's one advantage, and that is in the summer of 1940, America knew what enemy we would be facing. There was never a doubt that if a war came, it would be with Nazi Germany. And then by the fall of 1941, that would have to include the threat of a war with Imperial Japan. We knew who the enemy was going to be. We knew what their capabilities were, far superior to ours in the summer of 1940. Better equipped, better supplied, better technologies across the board. But we knew who the target was and what was going to be required to meet and surpass that target. All of the offsets, the successful offsets that Seth has outlined, all involved knowing who the enemy was going to be. Mm-hmm. The Soviet Union, in the case of the putative, of the normative first and second offsets. The great problem with the third offset, the mobilization of advanced technologies that got underway during the Obama Pentagon years, to which I give enormous credit, enormous foresight. The problem was it was all at the level of theory. There was, these are really cool capabilities. Wouldn't it be great to have these capabilities working for us full time and be engaged in artificial intelligence, robotics, autonomous systems here. If we're going to have a fourth offset, if we're going to achieve what Seth has outlined for us, and that what we've been talking about today, of gearing up an American industrial revival, a defense industrial revival with allies that is able to achieve what is possible, which I think is going to be achieved if we put our minds to it. That has to include an understanding of who the enemy is going to be. And the more you can focus on, these are China's capacity and capabilities, we have to find a way in which to surpass them, not just meet them and react to them, but go beyond them, to make them go back to the drawing board and rethink their entire strategy. That's what a fourth offset needs to be able to do, and that's the focus it's going to require here. It's going to make it more challenging when it comes to allies, particularly European allies. But then you've got another target, and that's Russia. And the degree to which the technologies that allow you to deter Russia and its threat to Eastern Europe and to the stability of NATO and European Union, so many of those do transfer over for the ways in which to deal with China as well. But World War II, we knew who the enemy was going to be and who that was. And that gave you a degree of focus, of concentration, of both for government and for industry that I think was essential to the success of the World War II miracle.
What I think becomes apparent in that discussion is, one, the globalized world we live in now that's unraveling to a certain degree, thinks about economic security and national security in an integrated way, or at least we need to start thinking about economic security and national security in a more integrated way. So if you had to begin to draw a line around industries that, let's say, are strategic and that may be treated differently, you very quickly get into a conversation around, say, industrial policy from a promotion perspective and certainly from a protectionist perspective, whether it's tariffs or increased use of export controls or CFIUS. So how do you think about that movement from a geoeconomic perspective as we move into a world now where, maybe we are going to be more comfortable with industrial policy. Maybe we are going to think about industries differently. How do we use the role of government intervention more broadly?
Yeah. No, I think I'm not scared by the term industrial policy. It's a question of how you organize it and who's the driving engine behind it. And industrial policy, rightly understood, which I think is what happened in World War II, where Roosevelt said to Bill Knudsen, put together your team, figure out, talk to the Army, which meant also the Air Force then, and the Navy, find out what it is they need in a war with Nazi Germany, and then you guys figure out how to do that. That seems to me an industrial policy that's reproducible and that could have enormously fruitful results in today's context, in today's environment.
I was going to add, one other dimension that's a little bit different today than during the kind of the Bill Knudsen years, that I think we haven't quite figured out how to take advantage of, and it does cross both the U.S. and allies in Europe and in Asia, which is when you look at the internal research and development that the technology companies are providing for advancements, whether it's Google or NVIDIA or Microsoft, they're spending enormous amounts of money that defense companies just don't have. Right. They can't. And so this is interesting question as part of this first breakfast is how well are we integrating the major advantages that our commercial technology companies have into our defense sector. Some defense companies spend a lot of money on artificial intelligence. We have the best companies in the world that are spending multiple billions of dollars on AI. And have been nervous about entering the defense space. So, and some of these are in Europe or in Asia as well. And so there's one really interesting question about how well we're doing this.
I think that's what I mean when I talk about widening the circle.
Yeah.
And I think if we're going to serve for a first breakfast,
Yeah.
you got to have the Mag 7 at the table.
But I think it also speaks to to what extent is our offset contingent on a software-centric approach to warfare as opposed to something that our conversation is just sort of focused on mobilization from an industrial perspective, but clearly software centricity is going to have to play a significant role.
Eric, I think there's another layer to this too that we need to pay attention to, which is to date, we've organized multilateral and plurilateral regimes to protect these technologies in the past, usually around proliferation concerns. We are proposing now to look at it from a geostrategic technological competition perspective, where a lot of the technologies we're discussing are really ones where there's going to be a social contract between the government and its citizens about how those technologies are used in a commercial context, and the values and norms of use in a crisis or conflict.
Are you thinking specifically about AI?
AI is an example, cyber is an example of that, quantum computing is an example of that. So the reason I mention that is there is an opportunity, but I think that it's going to take coalition building at a level that we're going to have to continue to work on. I don't think we're there in terms of shifting that paradigm.
And who do you see as the primary stakeholders in that coalition?
I would say our European allies, particularly our NATO allies, and then our allies in the Indo-Pacific, the democracies in the Indo-Pacific.
Can I just one other comment which hasn't come up yet? Arthur mentioned it briefly in the New Deal context with FDR, but it is important, I think, to highlight in everything we're talking about here is there's going to be a lot of pushback to what we've just talked about. There is. That anytime you start talking about money in the defense industrial base, it brings to the table people who will say, as FDR heard, you're just giving money to the military industrial complex. People will cite the Eisenhower speech as he leaves office, which is, I think, generally taken way out of context. There are people who will push back on we can't share technologies, even with some key allies and partners. Those are just too sensitive. They can't. So that at every stage of this, there's going to be pushback in a range of areas. And I would just say that's a fight that we're going to have to continue to have. And there are some technologies that the U.S. is going to have to protect. And you're certainly going to have to keep an eye on fraud, waste, and abuse, and corruption and illegal activity. There's no question about that. During the Cold War, there were these discussions about super expensive toilets or coffee machines in naval vessels. All of that is true. All of that, I think, can be handled within the system. But I just do want to highlight, as we talk about these issues, there will be a strong pushback for those who start getting concerned.
Right. And there will be pushback from those who we see as chief antagonists who will try to find ways to undermine the effort to bring our industrial base up to speed.
Yes.
And I would not at all underestimate the degree to which there will be effort by China and by Russia to discourage this kind of thinking that we've seen in the last hour.
Well, and you obviously have seen the Chinese take active measures to do that, right?
You have.
Overtly and subvertly, not just against us, but against our allies, right?
Yep.
And I think that's an important point as we think about that economic national security context, right? Where your competitor gets a vote, right? Because their competitor provides inputs into our supply chain that we haven't fully exercised yet.
That's a very important point.
From an American perspective. So maybe just as we close out here, as you think about the evolution, we've talked about the different stages of the defense industrial base. Are we entering a new phase or not? And if we are, what do you think that new phase looks like?
I think we are. What I sense, again, in talking to a rising generation of defense industrial base executives and talking to companies that are moving into this area, and who want to be even more involved. As I look at the way in which we go back to workforce, the way in which the space industry, commercial space industry, more and more sees their central role in terms of our national defense and national security here. I have used the term the next greatest generation to describe what I see underway here, something comparable to the push that came in that crucial year and a half before Pearl Harbor, before America was fully engaged in a war there. And I think that there is enormous energy and there's enormous innovation and bold thinking about how to get our defense industrial base into this next era that really needs to be tapped into, and it really needs to be involved in as we go forward.
Jen?
Yes, I think when you look at the current characteristics on the battlefield in Ukraine and even what's playing out in the Middle East right now, the first mover advantage in space, cyber, we've been talking about it a lot, but I think drilling down and understanding what that's going to mean from a policy authority acquisition perspective is going to be important. But the deeper fight, whoever wins round one, it's going to turn into what you get back into the nature of war, which is going to be brutal, direct conflict. And you're going to have a civilian population that's going to be impacted in a way that hasn't in the history of the United States. You're going to have private sector organizations, including companies, that are going to be perceived as actors on the battlefield that have to be navigated. And so, yes, I think we're in the next phase.
Seth, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the system is blinking red right now.
Yeah.
I think the U.S. defense industrial base, at the moment, there are major questions about whether the system as it exists today, the broader ecosystem, can provide the U.S. military with what it needs, and it's not an industry. This is government, industry, everybody, for a protracted conflict. It strikes me that how long have we been talking about munition shortfalls? Year after year, we run out of, take your pick, long-range anti-ship missiles after 7 days or so of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. I've been hearing that for years, and we're still in the same position. And so, for me, there's a real danger that the U.S. is losing deterrence, particularly in the Pacific right now. You know, I was 2 weeks ago, I was in Japan, went up on a sub-hunting mission in a P-8, and one of the interesting things, sitting up with the pilots as we're flying just south of Taiwan, north of Luzon, and then turning down into the South China Sea, near the Scarborough Shoals, is that environment there, as you're looking at the intel picture, is littered with Chinese surface vessels, aircraft, submarines. They are, as Sam Paparo has mentioned multiple times, he doesn't characterize Chinese activity in that region as exercises anymore. They're rehearsals, and you see that with just the pattern of activity. And
They're waiting.
They are waiting. They are waiting. And I think that the worry is if we do not make the changes we're talking about, and the Chinese really get more confident that we cannot fight a sustained conflict in their backyard, where it's probably a little bit easier logistically for them because they're there, we've got a big deterrence problem. So for me, that the system is blinking red right now, and it comes down to deterrence. And can the industrial base, as it sits right now, effectively deter the Chinese from acting? And I would say probably not at this point. And I think every day that goes by where we don't fix what we're talking about here, we make a weaker case for that. And that is what it took for FDR to realize, both for Nazi Germany and for Japan. That's what it took for Eisenhower seeing the Soviets arrayed in Europe. That's what it took for both Carter and Brown and Perry. It's what it took for Reagan to recognize that every day that went by that we did not fix this problem was a day that was going to leave us in a worse position. And so how do we take what we've talked about and action it in a more urgently than we have right now? That is where we are at, I think.
And I think a sense of urgency is probably a good note to end on, because you're right. I think we all need to feel a very strong sense of urgency. So I want you to thank the panel for me. Appreciate the discussion. I believe we're expecting folks to arrive at 10 o'clock for the next panel, so you're on break until then. Thank you.